Hey guys, tonight we're going to step away from the grand, sweeping narratives of kings and continents and dive headfirst into a more personal kind of disaster. You've heard the stories, the timeless tales of danger in the woods, of innocent souls wandering into the path of a fearsome predator. But what if we told those stories not with a happily ever after, but with a sobering, historically minded, and frankly, a bit miserable look at what actually might have happened to the unfortunate victims you probably wouldn't have survived. That's the reality check we're looking at tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you get settled in, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fun to see how far our little corner of the internet stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're there, in the deep, dark woods, and the air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Every twig that snaps under your boot sounds like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. You're not looking for a wolf, of course. No one ever is. You're just trying to get from one place to another, a simple task that, in the history of human storytelling, has proven to be an astonishingly lethal endeavour. You see, the wolf, the proverbial big bad wolf, isn't just a character, he's a symbol, a stand-in for every tangible and intangible threat lurking just beyond the firelight. He's famine, he's disease, he's the cruel bite of winter, and he's the very real terror of a world that doesn't care about your well-being. The stories we're used to the sanitized, Disney-fied versions paint the wolf as a cunning but ultimately defeatable villain. He gets tricked, he gets outsmarted, he gets a rock in his stomach and drowns in a river. But let's be honest, that's not how it works. That's not how anything works. The real world of the past, the one you're now wandering through, is far more brutal and less concerned with a satisfying narrative arc. The truth is, a wolf's fate is inextricably linked to the fate of the people around it. Its misery is a reflection of theirs, and its desperation is born from a shared struggle for survival. You're not just a character in a fairy tale, you're a moving, breathing, walking bag of calories, and you've just strayed a little too far from the safety of the village. Think about the time period. You're likely in some version of medieval Europe, a place where life expectancy is a grim statistic and dental hygiene is a lost art. You might be a shepherd, a woodcutter, or perhaps just a child sent on an errand. The forest, far from being a magical wonderland, is a place of genuine and constant peril. It's not just wolves you have to worry about. There are bandits, rival clans, and the very real possibility of getting hopelessly lost. The wolf, however, is a threat that's both predictable and terrifying. It's an animal, driven by pure instinct, and its motives are simple hunger. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the wolf's real-life reputation. Contrary to popular belief, wolves weren't typically hunting humans. Humans were big, noisy, and had pointy sticks. But a wolf, desperate and starving during a harsh winter, wouldn't think twice about a lone, defenseless child or an elderly person. This is a common historical fact in many parts of medieval Europe. Wolves were a significant menace to livestock, and in times of famine, attacks on isolated humans were not unheard of. It's this terrifying reality that forms the bedrock of our stories, a cultural memory of a time when the world was a little wilder and a little less safe. The stories became cautionary tales, a way to teach children to stay on the path and not talk to strangers, but they were also a way for people to process a fear that was a very real part of their daily lives. Imagine the psychological toll of that. Every time you left the safety of your home, you carried with you the knowledge that the world outside was full of things that wanted to hurt you. Historians still debate whether the pervasive wolf folklore of this era was a direct reflection of actual attacks or if the stories themselves, and through their repetition and vivid imagery, amplified and maintained a generalized fear of the wilderness. It's a classic chicken and egging situation, and one that doesn't have a clear answer. Was the fear real, or did the stories make it real? Let's imagine you're one of those people now. You're a shepherd, and you're walking through a field, the kind of field that's mostly mud and rocks and the occasional patch of tough, edible-ish grass. Your sheep are bleating, a sound that's less a peaceful symphony and more a desperate complaint, and then you see it, not the whole wolf, just a flash of grey fur disappearing behind a gnarled oak tree. That's the moment your heart sinks into your stomach. Your hands start to feel clammy. You've seen this before. It's not just one wolf. It's a pack that is probably far hungrier than you'd like to admit. You clutch your shepherd's crook a little tighter, a flimsy piece of wood that feels as useful as a chocolate teapot in a knife fight. The wolf in the stories, the cunning predator, is often depicted as a lone entity. The reality, however, is that wolves are pack animals. They work together, they communicate, and when a pack sets its sights on a target, it's not just a matter of who's the smartest or the quickest. It's a matter of overwhelming odds. You might be a big, strong human, but you're no match for a coordinated team of 600 or 700 pound predators. You're a little like that guy in a modern horror movie who thinks he can take on the monster with a baseball bat. It's cute, but it's not going to end well. Let's move on to an interesting and slightly gross detail about the reality of living with wolves. This is an obscure historical detail, while we often think of wolf hunting as a simple matter of tracking and killing. Some communities in Eastern Europe developed a specific ritual around the animal's remains. After a wolf was killed, its skull would be hung on a pole or the roof of a house. The belief was that the wolf spirit, seeing the fate of its physical form, would be so terrified that it would warn off other wolves, making them afraid to approach the village. Think of it as a sort of medieval anti-theft sign, but with a lot more intimidation and a lot more skull. So you're the shepherd, and you're starting to sweat. You try to pretend you haven't seen the wolf. You whistle a jaunty tune, a terrible, off-key sound that probably just annoys the wildlife. You walk a little faster, your boots squelching in the mud. The sheep, sensing your anxiety, start to get jumpy, their frantic bleating turning into a cacophony of pure panic. This, of course, is the worst possible thing. Panic is a sign of weakness, and the wolves, who've been watching you from the shadows, know this. They've been watching you for a while. They've seen you trip over that root. They've heard your pathetic, tuneless whistling. They're not going to be fooled by your brave face. The stories of the big bad wolf are so much a part of our collective consciousness that it's easy to forget their original purpose. They weren't just for children. They were for adults, too. They were a way of making sense of the chaos of the world. The wolf in the story isn't just an animal. It's a personification of every bad thing that can happen to you. It's the plague that sweeps through the village. It's the crops that fail. It's the bandit on the road. The wolf represents the loss of control. The idea that no matter how hard you work or how well you plan, some things are simply out of your hands. And you, walking through the woods, are about to have a very, very hard lesson in just how little control you have. The fear, the anxiety, the absolute terror is all part of the experience. It's a slow building dread, a sense that something is not right, that you are not alone, and the wolves are happy to let that dread simmer. They don't need to rush. You are, after all, a large, unwieldy target, and they have all the time in the world. They're not just hunting you, they're herding you. They're using the terrain, the trees, the gullies, to force you into a position where you're at your most vulnerable. They're the original strategic masterminds, and you're just a pawn on their chessboard. You could try to fight, of course. You could swing your shepherd's crook with all your might, but that would be a little like trying to swat a mosquito with a bowling ball. You'd probably hit yourself in the head. It's a nice thought. though very heroic, very much a hero who's about to be a tragic footnote in a very sad story. The tragedy of the big bad wolf's victims is that they are not, as we are led to believe, heroes who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They are, for the most part, simply victims. They are children who didn't listen, or they are people who were just trying to get by in a world that was stacked against them. There is no moral lesson to be learned here, other than the fact that sometimes bad things just happen. The wolf doesn't care if you're a good person or a bad person. The wolf doesn't care if you're rich or poor. The wolf only cares if you're hungry. And you're about to find out just how hungry it is. The stories we tell ourselves about the wolf, about the fairy tales and the happy endings, are a way of insulating ourselves from the real world. They're a way of pretending that there is order in the chaos, that there is justice in the universe. But the truth is, sometimes the wolf wins, and sometimes you just disappear, and the world moves on without you, a little colder and a little less safe than it was before. And that, my friends, is the most miserable fate of all. The final insult isn't the teeth or the claws or the hunger. The final insult is the silence of a world that doesn't even notice you're gone, the silence of a story that ends before it even begins. And that, in a nutshell, is the reality of the big bad wolf's grand entrance. Last time, we left you trembling in the dark woods, the oppressive silence broken only by the frantic bleating of your sheep. You felt the slow, creeping dread of being a target, not of a villain, but of a force of nature driven by pure, unadulterated hunger. You learned that the wolf is a symbol for everything that can go wrong in a world that doesn't care about you. Tonight, let's get a little more specific. Let's talk about a famous case study in poor planning, a cautionary tale that we've all heard, but one that has been scrubbed clean of all its grim reality. We're talking, of course, about those 3 little pigs. You're standing there, looking at this baffling architectural project. The sun is shining, the birds are chirping, and in front of you, a small, pink-skinned creature is putting the finishing touches on what can only be described as a pile of loose straw. You can't help but wince. It's not so much a house as it is a fire hazard with a door. A light breeze rustles through the stalks, and you can already see a few strands pulling free. You wonder what the building inspectors would say. If, building inspectors were a thing that existed in this period. The sheer audacity of the whole thing is staggering. This pig, this little, innocent, rosy-cheeked pig, has decided that the best way to protect itself from a world of peril is with dried vegetation. It's a decision that, from a historical and survivalist perspective, is just not smart. Historically, the use of straw as a building material wasn't entirely a fantasy. People used thatch for roofs, and it was a common, cheap, and easily accessible material for temporary shelters or the most basic of peasant hovels. But to build an entire wall out of it, that's a different story. Straw holds no structural integrity. It offers no protection against the elements, let alone a hungry predator. It's a literal house of cards, and you can't help but feel a little sad for the pig, who seems so proud of his flimsy abode. He's whistling a happy tune, probably dreaming about all the spare time he'll have, now that his house is complete. You, on the other hand, are already starting to feel the chill of a coming winter, and you know this house isn't going to hold up against anything more substantial than a strong sneeze. Let's think about the economics of the situation. This pig has chosen the cheapest, easiest option. He hasn't invested any time, any effort, or any real thought into his future. He's a perfect example of what can happen when you prioritize immediate gratification over long-term security. The other 2 pigs, you'll soon see, made slightly better, but still fundamentally flawed decisions. This little guy, however, is a poster child for an absolutely miserable fate. His story isn't a cautionary tale about laziness. It's a grim lesson in what happens when you are so naive, so blissfully unaware of the world's dangers, that you essentially hand yourself over on a silver platter. Now, let's turn our attention to the second pig, the one who's built his house out of sticks. It's a slightly more impressive structure. He's woven the sticks together, maybe even used some mud or clay to fill in the gaps, a building technique known as wattle and daub. This is a common historical fact. Wattle and daub was a widespread construction method for lower-class homes for centuries. It was better than straw, to be sure, and it offered some defence against the wind and rain. The walls are a little crooked, and the roof is a bit uneven, but you can see that at least some effort has been made. This pig is a bit of an amateur, a DIY enthusiast, who probably watched one too many YouTube tutorials and decided he was an expert. He's also whistling a happy tune, a little different from his brothers, but just as oblivious. You look at the walls and you can already tell that a determined push from a strong enough predator could cause the whole thing to buckle. It's a house of sticks, not of bricks, and it's built on a foundation of wishful thinking. The third pig, the one who built his house out of bricks, is the supposed hero of the story. You see him working, his little pink forehead furrowed in concentration. He's mixing mortar, laying bricks, and building a foundation that looks sturdy and secure. This house is a testament to hard work and foresight, but even here, in this supposed sanctuary, there's a problem. This is a subtle, little-known historical detail. The quality of bricks in this era was, let's just say, variable. Without modern kilns and techniques, many bricks would be soft, brittle, and susceptible to crumbling. The mortar, too, might be little more than a mixture of mud and lime, far from the strong, durable cements we know today. So while this pig's house is 1,000 times better than his brother's, it's not an impenetrable fortress. It's still just a house, and a house, in the real world, has vulnerabilities. The chimney, for instance, a convenient entryway for a determined predator, or the windows, a weak point in any defensive structure. This pig has done his best, but he's still not entirely safe. His fate, while better than his brother's, is still far from guaranteed. Now, let's bring back the wolf. He's not a clumsy, cartoonish villain. He's a smart, strategic predator. He's been watching these 3 pigs for a while, just like he was watching you. He saw the first pig building his straw house, and he probably just rolled his eyes. He saw the second one, and he probably thought, okay, a little more effort here, but still, really. And then he saw the third one, and he realised this one would take a bit more work, but the wolf is patient. He's got time. His hunger is a constant companion, a fire in his belly that drives him forward, and so he makes his move, starting with the weakest of the 3. You watch as the wolf approaches the straw house. He doesn't huff and puff and blow it down like in the story. That's a children's tale, a simplified narrative for simplified minds. Instead, he just starts pulling at it. He uses his claws, his teeth, and the sheer force of his body to tear at the flimsy walls. The straw gives way easily, a sad rustling sound that is utterly pathetic. The pig inside squeals, but it's a useless sound, a cry that is swallowed by the wind and the forest. The end for this pig is swift and brutal, a miserable consequence of a terrible life choice. There is no moral lesson here other than the fact that if you don't prepare for the worst will come for you, and it won't be a neat, tidy lesson. Tidy. Next, the wolf moves on to the stick house. He knows this one will take a bit more effort. He tries to pull the sticks apart, but they hold together. So he changes tactics. He starts to ram the walls with his body. A powerful repeated blow that makes the whole structure tremble. The little pig inside is terrified. He's running around, bumping into the wobbly walls, his little heart pounding in his chest. He can hear the cracking of the sticks, the groaning of the mud. The end here isn't as swift. It's a slow-motion terror, a creeping realization that his best effort, his wattle and daub masterpiece, is just not enough. And then, with a final, mighty shove, the walls give way, and the pig's screams are silenced. The moral of this story, if there is one, is that a little effort is sometimes just as bad as no effort at all. You're left with a third pig, the one in the brick house. The wolf is now exhausted and frustrated. He has eaten 2 pigs, but he's still hungry. And now he's facing a real challenge. He tries to huff and puff, and it's a useless effort. The bricks don't move. He tries to ram the walls, but he just hurts himself. He circles the house, looking for a weak spot. And that's when he sees the chimney. The wolf, in our story, is a dumb villain who gets tricked by a boiling cauldron. But the real wolf, the starving, desperate predator, is smart enough to know that a chimney is a flaw in any defensive structure. The pig inside, for all his hard work, has forgotten the most basic rule of survival: always cover your chimney. This pig, for all his foresight, has made a crucial error, an error that could be fatal. Historians still debate whether the story of the 3 little pigs was originally a tale about class, with the pigs representing different social strata. The first pig, with his straw house, could be seen as the lowest class, a peasant who had no resources to build a proper home. The second pig, with his stick house, could be a slightly more prosperous farmer, someone with a bit of land and a bit of a future. And the third pig, with his brick house, could be a representation of the rising middle class, someone who had the resources and the foresight to build a secure future for himself. But the story's ultimate conclusion, the wolf still being a threat even to the most prepared of them, suggests that no matter how hard you work or how high you climb, the forces of chaos and misery can still find a way in. It's a grim lesson, a reminder that the world is a dangerous place, and that even a happy ending can be just a moment of respite before the next disaster strikes. You've just witnessed the catastrophic consequences of shoddy craftsmanship, the miserable fate of those who put their trust in flimsy walls and wishful thinking. The echoes of the wolf's victory over the pig's ill-conceived homes are still hanging in the air, a low growl that serves as a grim reminder. But a house, no matter how poorly built, is still a barrier. It's a place where you can hide, a place where you can, for a brief moment, feel safe. Now, let's move past the illusion of safety and into a situation where there is no barrier at all. Let's talk about a girl, a basket of goodies, and a very, very long walk through a very, very dangerous place. We're talking about Little Red Riding Hood. You're there, walking beside her. She's small, she's innocent, and she's skipping down a path that's so narrow it barely feels like a path at all. The trees are tall and menacing, the light is dappled and uncertain, and every few feet you have to push aside a low-hanging branch. She doesn't seem to mind. She's humming a tune, a simple, happy melody that feels wildly out of place in this sombre, silent forest. She's wearing a brilliant red cloak, a detail that seems so charming in the story but feels so incredibly unwise now. It's a beacon, a bright, flashing signal that says, "Look at me. I'm here and I'm completely and utterly alone." It's the kind of thing that would get you a very stern talking to in a modern-day stranger danger class. The basket she's carrying is another tell. It's a basket of food, a simple fact that, in a world where food is not guaranteed, is a magnet for trouble. You smell the freshly baked bread, the sweet scent of butter and sugar. It's a scent that carries on the breeze, a delicious, irresistible signal to anything with a nose and a hungry belly. This is a common historical fact in these times. A solo journey through a forest, especially for a child, was fraught with danger. The forest was not a place for recreation. It was a wilderness filled with not only animals, but also vagabonds, poachers, and other desperate people. The girl's journey is not a whimsical stroll, it's a high-stakes gamble. And she has, in her youthful naivety, laid all her cards on the table. And then you see him, the wolf, not in the guise of a cartoon villain, but as a dark shape melting from the shadows. He's not a big, clumsy beast. He's a lean, efficient killing machine, a product of a brutal world. He watches the girl, his head cocked to the side, his ears perked. He smells the food. And he sees the bright red cloak. He recognizes the target. The interaction that follows isn't a conversation about flowers, it's a piece of strategic reconnaissance. The wolf isn't just trying to figure out where she's going, he's trying to figure out her weaknesses. He learns about the grandmother, about the little house at the edge of the woods, about the vulnerability of the entire situation. He's gathering intel, a brilliant and terrifyingly efficient predator. He takes off, a silent blur of grey and muscle. The girl, in her innocence, stops to pick flowers. She's completely unaware of the race that has just begun, a race she is hopelessly losing. The wolf arrives at the grandmother's house. The grandmother is old, frail, and as the story often leaves out, probably already very sick. She's lying in bed, a fragile, defenceless person in a world that has no use for the fragile and defenceless. The wolf's entry is not a gentle knock on the door. It's a brute force assault. The grandmother's fate is sealed the moment the wolf arrives. There is no negotiation, no conversation. There is only the brutal reality of a predator's hunger and a victim's frailty. Now, let's talk about the wolf's plan. He puts on the grandmother's nightgown and cap. This is, from a realistic perspective, an absolutely absurd move. He's a wolf. He's covered in fur. He has giant claws. And his face is a snout full of teeth. No amount of floral patterned clothing or frilly bonnets is going to make him look like a human. This is where the story's true tragedy lies. The girl isn't fooled because the wolf is a brilliant actor. She's fooled because she is a child. And she's walking into a situation she can't comprehend. She's so focused on her mission, on getting to her grandmother, that she is blind to the obvious. The wolf's disguise is a testament not to his cunning, but to the sheer innocence of his victim. So she arrives, and the scene plays out. What big eyes you have, Grandma. What big ears you have, Grandma. What big teeth you have, Grandma. These aren't questions from a child who's starting to suspect something. These are the frantic, panicked observations of a person who is realizing, with a creeping, nauseating dread, that something is terribly, terribly wrong. The wolf's famous line, "All the better to eat you with, my dear," isn't a clever retort. It's the sound of a desperate predator dropping all pretense. It's the sound of the end, and the end, for this girl, is swift. This is a slightly obscure historical detail. While we often think of the red cloak as being a random costume choice, some versions of the tale, particularly in French folklore, suggest that the red hood, or chaperone, was a symbol of a young woman's coming of age or her entry into a different social role. In this context, the wolf's attack isn't just about a hungry animal, it's a darker, more metaphorical tale about the loss of innocence and the perils that await a young woman in the world, a grim and brutal reminder that life is not a fairy tale. The story, as we know it, often ends with a woodcutter coming to the rescue. He hears the screams, he rushes in, he cuts the wolf open, and the girl and her grandmother pop out, completely unharmed. This, of course, is utter nonsense. There is no way a person could be eaten by a wolf and then simply emerge from its stomach, clean and whole in the original, more brutal versions of the tale. There is no woodcutter. The story ends with the wolf's meal, but even in the sanitized version, the outcome for everyone involved is miserable. The woodcutter, a simple man just trying to do his job, is now a witness to a horrific scene of violence. He's seen a predator in its element. He's seen the brutal end of two people, and he's now tasked with the grim task of cleaning up the mess. His own mental state, his own peace of mind, is now forever poisoned by what he's seen. He's not a hero. He's just another victim in this miserable story. And the wolf, even in the versions where he's defeated, doesn't get a dignified end. He doesn't get to run off and be a villain in another story. He's filled with stones and drowned. It's a messy, violent, and utterly miserable end for an animal that was only doing what its instincts told it to do. It's a death that is both a punishment and a sad. Pathetic final chapter for a creature that was a product of its environment. A desperate hunter in a starving world. The entire scene is a bloody, chaotic mess. A far cry from the clean, neat endings we've been taught to expect. There is no joy here, only a sense of profound sadness and loss. Historians still debate whether the tale of Little Red Riding Hood was a warning about stranger danger, or a deeper, more primal allegory about the loss of innocence. Was it a simple cautionary tale for children who might wander off the path, or was it a story for adults, a grim reflection on the dangers of the natural world, the frailty of life, and the brutal reality of a world where predators and victims are two sides of the same miserable coin? The answer, of course, is that it was probably both. It was a story that spoke to a universal fear, a fear that we still carry with us today, a fear of the dark woods, the unknown dangers, and the terrible, terrible things that can happen when you are simply not paying attention. The true misery of this story isn't the wolf's hunger or the girl's naivety. It's the absolute, unshakable finality of it all. It's a story that tells us that sometimes a simple, innocent errand can lead to a tragic, inevitable end. You've seen the misery that comes from architectural incompetence and the tragedy that stems from a child's simple naivety in those stories. The victims were largely passive, their fates determined by external forces, a flimsy house, a long walk in the woods. But what happens when the victim actively and repeatedly puts their own miserable fate into motion? What happens when the person who cries wolf is the one who ultimately suffers the most? Let's put aside the innocence and the structural failures for a moment and focus on a story of social contracts, boredom, and the very real consequences of breaking the rules. We're talking about Peter and the wolf. You're there, on a vast windswept hill. The grass is dry and brittle, and the wind is a constant. Low moan in your ears. The sky is a vast, empty expanse of blue, and the only other living things around are a few dozen, very, very dull sheep. Their bleating is a monotonous, repetitive sound that does little to break the soul-crushing silence of the landscape. And then there's Peter, the boy shepherd. He's sitting on a rock, whittling a stick with a small, dull knife. His eyes glazed over with a profound and bone-deep boredom. His life is a routine of watching sheep eat grass. Sheep wander a few feet, and sheep eat more grass. There's no YouTube, no video games, no social media. His only form of entertainment is the occasional cloud that looks vaguely like a rabbit. You can't help but feel for the kid. You'd probably go insane too. The loneliness of the shepherd's life is a historical reality that often gets lost in the telling of this story. These weren't just children. They were workers, often alone for days on end, responsible for the most precious asset a village had, its livestock. This is a common historical fact. Sheep were not just a source of food. They provided wool for clothing and blankets, and their milk could be made into cheese. The loss of a flock to a predator was not just a sad story. It was an economic disaster that could spell starvation for an entire community. The shepherd's job, while boring, was one of immense importance and responsibility. Peter, in his boredom, is about to make a mockery of that responsibility. His first cry of, wolf isn't a malicious act. It's a desperate cry for attention. It's a way of breaking the monotony, of injecting a bit of excitement into his otherwise desolate existence. He's bored, and he's lonely, and he's probably just a little bit hungry for human contact. So he cries out, and you can see the ripple effect. Down in the village, men drop their tools, women grab their children, a collective panic spreads like wildfire. They grab pitchforks and scythes, the only weapons they have, and they run, huffing and puffing, up the hill. Their faces are a mixture of fear and exhaustion. They're not just coming to save the sheep, they're coming to save their very lives. And when they get there, they see Peter laughing a mean, cruel laugh that says, "Gotcha," the first time. The villagers are angry, but they're also relieved. They scold the boy, telling him not to joke about such things. The second time, the anger is a little sharper, the relief a little dimmer. The third time, you can see the trust eroding, a foundational pillar of their community crumbling under the weight of a child's pranks. The villagers aren't just wasting their time and energy, they're wasting their most valuable resource, their trust in one another. And in a society where a shared sense of community is the only thing standing between you and utter chaos, that's a mistake that can be fatal. Let's think about the other side of the story. The real wolf. He's not an idiot. He's not a cartoon villain. He's a smart, opportunistic predator who has been watching and waiting. He's seen the villagers run up the hill, pitchforks in hand. He's seen them get angry and go back down. He's learned a very important lesson: the shepherd boy is a liar, and the villagers are a bunch of suckers. He has, in a way, been trained by the boy. He has learned that the cries of wolf are a signal, not of danger, but of a false alarm. He has learned to ignore the boy's cries. And so, on the day the real wolf finally comes, he comes with a sense of certainty. He knows there will be no resistance. The day the real wolf comes is a day much like any other. The sun is shining, the sheep are bleating, and Peter is bored. He looks up from his whittling and sees a shadow, not a flash of fur, but a deep, grey shape that seems to melt from the trees at the edge of the field. It's not one wolf, it's several, a pack, and they're not just looking at the sheep, they're looking at him. His heart sinks into his stomach, a cold, hard lump of dread. This is not a prank, this is real. He opens his mouth and he screams, a real, terrified sound that is a world away from his earlier, false cries. Wolf, wolf, the wolf is here. And down in the village, the people hear him. They hear the scream, a sound that is both familiar and, for some reason, different. It's the sound of genuine terror, not of childish amusement. But they hesitate. They look at one another, a silent, weary conversation passing between them. They've been fooled before. They've dropped their tools and run up that hill for nothing. They have more important things to do. The crops need to be harvested. The children need to be fed. They cannot afford to waste their time on another prank. And so, they stay put. This is a slightly obscure historical detail. Village communities in this era often had a formal, or at least understood, system of defence against predators, a collective responsibility that was a cornerstone of their survival. Peter's actions have, in effect, broken that system, shattered the trust that held it all together, and left the community defenceless. The consequences for Peter are, of course, swift and brutal. The wolf, having been trained to ignore his cries, now has free rein. The sheep, a panicked, mindless mob, scatter in all directions. The boy, with his small, dull knife, is no match for a pack of hungry wolves. His fate is not a neat, tidy lesson about the dangers of lying. It's a messy, violent, and utterly miserable end, a consequence of his own making, a product of his own loneliness and desperation. The miserable fate here isn't just about the wolf's teeth and claws, it's about the self-inflicted wounds of isolation, of losing the trust of your community, and of facing a mortal threat completely alone. Historians still debate whether the story of Peter and the wolf was a simple cautionary tale about the dangers of lying or a deeper, more profound allegory about the fragility of community? Was it a story for children about the importance of telling the truth? Or was it a story for adults about the cost of social decay? The danger of a community that can no longer rely on itself? It was likely both. The story, in its grim reality, tells us that a lie is not just a lie, it's a poison that can corrupt the very foundations of a society, leaving everyone, even the most innocent among us, to face their own personal disasters, alone. The misery of this story isn't the boy's death, it's the fact that it was entirely avoidable, a tragedy born not of bad luck, but of a bad choice. You've just been a spectator to a very grim lesson in social decay, a lesson about the misery that comes from a community losing its trust. But what happens when that misery is not a product of a lie, but of a parent's worst nightmare? What happens when a mother, in a desperate attempt to protect her children, makes a calculation that is just wrong? Let's leave behind the windswept hills and the sound of broken trust, and enter a small, secluded house at the edge of the forest, a place where a mother is about to learn the terrible price of a parent's gamble. We're talking about the 7 young goats. You're standing outside the small, cottage-like home, and you can feel the quiet anxiety that permeates the air. The mother goat, a weary-looking creature with kind eyes, is trying to give her children a set of rules. The 7 young goats are a bundle of playful energy, and they're not really listening. They're bumping into each other, pulling at their mother's wool, and generally acting like, well, kids. And in a way, that's the whole tragedy of the story. They're just being kids in a world that requires them to be adults. The mother's warnings are simple. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't have a sweet voice and a white paw. It's a simple, elegant set of rules, but it's based on a flawed assumption that a predator is too stupid to adapt. The mother's departure isn't a casual trip to the grocery store, it's a desperate necessity. This is a common historical fact in these times. A mother, especially a single mother with many children, would often have to leave her children alone to find food. The world was a place of scarcity, and the choice between leaving your children alone and watching them starve was a terrible one. The mother goat's journey into the forest is a high-stakes gamble, a desperate search for provisions that will allow her family to survive for another day. She's not being neglectful. She's being a parent in a world that offers very few good options. The moment she leaves, the mood inside the house changes. The playful energy is replaced by a nervous, twitchy silence. The children huddle together, their small hearts thumping in their chests. They're alone, and they know it. And then, there's a knock at the door. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath. The wolf, a cunning and intelligent predator, has arrived. He's not a clumsy buffoon, he's a master of deception, a strategist who has been listening and watching, and he's ready to exploit the mother's well-intentioned, but ultimately naive instructions. His voice is a low, gruff sound, and the children, remembering their mother's words, say no. They've passed the first test, but the wolf is patient. He's not going to give up that easily. His next move is a stroke of evil genius. He goes to a baker and gets some flour, covering his paw with it, making it soft and white. Then he goes to a vendor and gets some chalk, eating it to make his voice high and sweet. This is a slightly obscure historical detail. The use of chalk and flour as a tool for deception is a recurring motif in European folklore, symbolizing a false purity or innocence that is used to trick the naive. The wolf isn't just trying to sound like a goat. He's trying to become a false symbol of everything the mother told her children to look for. He's taking the mother's own rules and turning them against her. A cruel and brilliant piece of psychological warfare. He returns to the house, and he knocks again. "Open the door, my dear children. Your mother is home and has brought you a treat." His voice is now sweet and gentle, a perfect imitation of the mother's. The children, still suspicious, ask to see his paw. He shows it to them, and it is a perfect ghostly white. You can see the relief on their faces. The collective sigh of a family who believes they have passed the test. They've followed the rules, they've done everything their mother told them to do, but in their obedience, they have made a fatal mistake. They open the door. The moment the door opens, the air is filled with a terrible, terrified scream. The wolf isn't a gentle creature, he's a ravenous beast. He devours the 7 young goats, one after another, in a moment of pure, unadulterated savagery. This isn't a neat, tidy eating. It's a messy, violent affair that is utterly miserable for everyone involved. The 7 goats are swallowed whole, but they are not killed immediately. They are alive, trapped in a hot, suffocating prison, a living nightmare that is the very definition of a miserable fate. There is no joy in this victory, only the cold, hard reality of a predator's hunger and a victim's terror. The one small goat who hid in the clock, a lucky survivor, is a grim witness to the whole affair, a living reminder of the horror that has just unfolded. When the mother returns, she finds the house in a state of utter chaos. The door is ajar, the furniture is overturned, and there is a terrible, final silence that hangs in the air. Her heart, which had been beating with the rhythm of her desperate search for food, now stops completely. She calls out for her children, but there is no answer. Her gamble has failed, her worst nightmare has come to pass. She finds the one small goat in the clock, and he tells her the terrible story. Her grief is a physical thing, a deep and primal scream that tears through the quiet of the forest, but her grief is quickly replaced by a cold, hard anger. She sees the wolf, a bloated, sleepy creature, lying under a tree, his stomach a terrible, lurching testament to his meal. She knows what she has to do. The climax of the story, the mother cutting the wolf open and the children emerging, is often told as a moment of joy and triumph. But you're there, and you see the grim reality of it. It's a messy, gruesome affair. The children, emerging from the wolf's stomach, are traumatized, covered in the filth and gastric juices of their prison. They're not happy, they're terrified. Their rescue is not a moment of unbridled joy, it's the end of a nightmare, a trauma that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And the mother, who has just committed a violent act of vengeance, is not a hero. She is a woman who has been pushed to the absolute edge, a parent who has done a terrible, necessary thing. Historians still debate whether the story of the 7 young goats was a simple cautionary tale about stranger danger, or a deeper reflection on the impossible choices parents face in a world of limited resources and constant peril. Was it a story about a mother's failure, or was it a story about a predator's brilliant manipulation? It was likely both. The misery of this story isn't the wolf's hunger or the children's naivety, it's the mother's gamble, a terrible choice that she had to make, and the grim reality that even with the best intentions and the most careful of instructions, the world can still be a cruel and unforgiving place. The true tragedy is the sheer randomness of it all, the fact that a few simple tricks could lead to a family's ruin. You've witnessed the misery that comes from naivety, from broken trust, and from a mother's terrible gamble. In each of these stories, the wolf was a singular, terrifying force, a predator driven by a very simple hunger. But what happens when the wolf is no longer a lone wolf? What happens when he finds a partner, an ally in his quest for food? The answer, as you're about to see, is that things can get even more miserable, not just for the victims, but for the wolf himself. Let's talk about a partnership born of desperation and driven by a fatal difference in intelligence. We're talking about the wolf and the fox. You're there, in the same woods, but the atmosphere feels different. The air isn't just thick with the smell of pine, it's also tinged with the scent of a bad idea. The wolf, a big, brawny, and frankly, not very smart creature, is walking with a fox, a small, sly, and deeply cynical animal, the fox is chattering away, his voice a quick, high-pitched stream of promises and schemes. The wolf, for his part, is just nodding and grunting, his one-track mind focused entirely on his empty stomach. This isn't a friendship, it's a business arrangement. The fox provides the brains, and the wolf provides the brawn. It's a classic deal with the devil, and you can already tell who's going to get the short end of the stick. The fox is a master manipulator, a creature of pure, unadulterated self-interest. He sees the wolf not as a friend, but as a tool, a big dumb, four-legged shovel to get what he wants. And what he wants, of course, is a chicken, or a goose, or anything else that is easier to get when you have a big, scary wolf on your side. Their first caper is a testament to this dynamic. The fox, with his quick wit and his knowledge of the local terrain, leads the wolf to a chicken coop. He's the lookout, the strategist, the one who whispers, "Go on, big guy, get in there. You're the muscle." The wolf, in his infinite stupidity, just goes in, a big, clumsy, furious blur of teeth and claws. The plan, of course, goes wrong almost immediately. The wolf, in his haste, trips over a bucket. The chickens start squawking. The farmer, a man who has heard this symphony of terror before, comes running out with a shotgun. The fox, in a moment of pure self-preserving genius, just disappears into the bushes, leaving the wolf to fend for himself. The wolf, of course, gets shot in the leg, a painful, miserable wound that will never quite heal right. He hobbles back to their little hideout, bloody and bruised, and the fox is there, waiting for him, eating a chicken he must have snuck out during the chaos. "Oh, my dear friend," he says, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You are just too big for those small coops. What a shame. But look, I got us a little snack." The wolf, in his pain and his hunger, doesn't even question it. He just eats. The misery here is the wolf's, a product of his own gullibility and a terrible partnership. This is a common historical fact. Fables and folk tales often personified animals to represent different human characteristics. The fox, in these stories, was a symbol of cunning, intelligence, and often deceit. The wolf, on the other hand, was a representation of brute strength, gluttony, and a lack of intelligence. These stories weren't just about animals, they were moral allegories about the types of people you might encounter in the world. The story of the wolf and the fox is a grim warning about the dangers of aligning yourself with a person who is smarter and more ruthless than you are. The fox's next trick is even crueler. He and the wolf are both starving. And the fox, a master of psychological manipulation, convinces the wolf that he knows a secret spot where all the best food is. The wolf, of course, falls for it. The fox leads him to a well, one of those old-fashioned ones with 2 buckets on a rope. The fox jumps into one of the buckets, and he starts to go down. "Don't worry, my friend," he says. "Just jump into the other bucket and you'll come down, too." The wolf, in his absolute desperation and his complete lack of understanding of physics, just does it. He jumps into the bucket, and of course, he plummets to the bottom, a heavy, soaking wet creature with no way out. The fox, in his bucket, just calmly rises to the top, a small, smug smile on his face. He leaves the wolf there, a miserable, cold, and utterly defeated creature at the bottom of a well. The misery here isn't a quick death. It's a slow, humiliating process of being outsmarted by a creature you thought was your friend. Historians still debate whether these stories were simply fables about animal behaviour, or if they were political allegories about the relationship between different social classes. The wolf, with his brute strength and his lack of intelligence, could be seen as the brutish, unthinking nobility, a force that was powerful but easily manipulated. The fox, with his cunning and his ability to get what he wants through deceit, could be a representation of the clever, but less powerful, peasantry, who had to use their wits to survive in a world where brute force was the ultimate law. It's a classic underdog story, but with a very cynical twist. The underdog doesn't just win. He wins by completely and utterly destroying his so-called ally. Let's think about the fox's final act of betrayal. He and the wolf are hungry again. And the fox, in a moment of pure evil, decides to trick the wolf into a trap. He leads him to a patch of land that he knows is a hunter's snare, a grim device of rope and sharpened sticks that is designed to catch a much smaller animal. "Go on," he says. "The biggest, juiciest chicken you've ever seen is just on the other side of that little rope." The wolf, in his desperation and his complete inability to learn from his past mistakes, just goes for it. He steps into the trap, and the rope snaps around his leg, a tight, painful, and ultimately inescapable snare. The fox, of course, just watches, a cold, unfeeling look in his eyes. He is not a friend, he is a monster, a creature who has used the wolf's hunger and his stupidity to get what he wants. This is a slightly obscure historical detail. While we often think of the fox as a simple trickster, in some traditions, he was seen as a symbol of a particular kind of cleverness that was both admired and feared in medieval society. This type of cunning, known as renardi, was a survival skill in a world where brute force often ruled. The fox, in this sense, is not just a character, he is an archetype, a representation of a kind of intelligence that is both brilliant and deeply immoral. The wolf, caught in the trap, is left to a miserable fate. He's not a hero. And he's not a villain. He's just a victim. A creature who has been used and discarded by a partner who was smarter, faster, and more ruthless than he could ever hope to be. The misery here isn't the physical pain of the trap. It's the psychological pain of betrayal. The terrible realization that he has been a fool all along. His death, when it comes, is not a moment of triumph or a moment of poetic justice. It's just the end of a sad, stupid, and miserable story. A story about a predator who was too dumb to see that the real predator was the one he was walking beside all along. The true misery here isn't the wolf's end. It's the fact that he was so easily, so consistently, and so completely outsmarted by a creature he thought was on his side. You've witnessed the misery that comes from a terrible partnership, the sting of betrayal, and the utter humiliation of being outsmarted by a creature you thought was your friend. The wolf, having learned his lesson the hard way, is now alone again, nursing his wounds and his bruised ego. But a hungry wolf is a desperate wolf, and a desperate wolf is a dangerous wolf. He's tired of being the brawn, tired of being the fool. He's going to take matters into his own paws. He's going to use his own wits, such as they are, to get what he wants, and in doing so, he is about to embark on a plan so deeply flawed, so tragically ironic, that it will lead to a misery of a completely different kind. We're talking about an unlucky wolf in sheep's clothing. You're there, watching him. He's a solitary figure, his fur matted with burrs and his eyes narrowed with a new, dangerous purpose. His plan, you can already tell, is a bad one. He's going to disguise himself as a sheep. This requires, of course, a sheepskin, which is not something you just find lying around. The acquisition of the sheepskin is a brutal, messy affair, a quick, violent end for a poor, defenseless sheep who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a grisly, unpleasant business, and you can already see that this plan is a product of desperation, not of cleverness. He pulls the skin over himself, a clumsy, ill-fitting costume that is both hot and deeply uncomfortable. He looks less like a sheep and more like a wolf who has just lost a wrestling match with a very large, very dead sheep. Now he's among the flock. The sheep, in their collective stupidity, don't notice him, or maybe they do, but they're too polite to say anything. He's an awkward, clumsy figure, his movements a bit too quick, his posture a bit too low to the ground. The skin is a suffocating blanket in the midday sun, a foul-smelling cloak that is making him hot, itchy, and profoundly miserable. The days pass, a blur of monotonous grazing and mindless bleating. The wolf, in his disguise, is a prisoner in his own plot. He can't eat the sheep, because that would give away his disguise. He can't run off and get food, because that would also give away his disguise. He's a wolf in a sheep costume, and he's starving to death, a prisoner of his own very bad idea. The misery here isn't the physical pain of a trap or a gunshot. It's the slow, grinding torment of a plan gone horribly, terribly wrong. This is a common historical fact in these times. Wolf attacks on sheep flocks were a genuine and constant threat. Shepherds would use a variety of methods to protect their flocks, from guard dogs to armed patrols, but the most important tool they had was their own vigilance, their ability to spot a predator in their midst. The wolf in this story has managed to bypass all of these defences, not through cunning, but through a disguise so obvious, so ridiculously bad, that it is almost genius. He is a predator who is so inept, so desperate, that he has become his own worst enemy. The sheep, in their collective obliviousness, are not even aware of the danger. They're just eating grass, and the wolf is just slowly, miserably starving to death. The shepherd, an ordinary man with a tired face and calloused hands, is a constant presence. He's not a hero. He's just a man trying to do his job. He doesn't see the wolf's disguise. He just sees another sheep. A big, healthy-looking sheep that seems to be a little bit out of place. He's not a genius, and he's not a detective. He's just a man who has a job to do, and that job, today, is to shear the sheep. The shepherd has no idea that the creature he's about to shear is a wolf. He just sees a sheep that needs to be sheared, a task that is both necessary and, in a strange, ironic way, a form of self-sabotage for the wolf. The misery here is the wolf's, a product of his own stupidity and a very, very bad plan. And so, the shepherd grabs the wolf, a big struggling creature that he just assumes is a particularly difficult sheep. The wolf, in his panic, can't fight back. He can't make a sound, because that would give him away. He's trapped in his own disguise, a prisoner of his own foolishness. The shepherd lays him down, and he starts to shear. The shears, a sharp, unpleasant tool, are a slow, torturous instrument of the wolf's demise. He's not being killed in a quick, violent way. He's being killed in a slow, tedious, and utterly humiliating way. He's being shorn to death, a victim of his own ridiculous plan. The shepherd, in his ignorance, is not a hero. He's just a man doing his job, and the wolf, in his desperation, is just a victim of a very, very bad idea. This is a slightly obscure historical detail. In some medieval communities, a shepherd's flock would be marked with a specific brand or paint, a symbol of their ownership and a way of identifying a lost or stolen sheep. The wolf, of course, would have no such mark, a detail that a smarter, more observant shepherd might have noticed. But the shepherd in this story is just a man with a job to do. He's not a detective. He just sees a sheep that needs to be sheared, and he goes about his business. The irony here is that the wolf's disguise is both perfect and completely, utterly flawed. It's perfect enough to fool the sheep, but it's not perfect enough to fool a man who knows his flock. And that, in a nutshell, is the misery of this story. Historians still debate whether this story was a simple moral fable about the dangers of deception or a deeper allegory about the dangers of losing your identity. Was it a story about a wolf who tried to be something he wasn't? Or was it a story about a predator who, in his desperation, forgot who he was? It was likely both. The misery of this story isn't the wolf's death, it's the fact that it was a slow, tedious and completely unremarkable end. He didn't die a noble death in a fight. He didn't die a heroic death in a trap. He died a slow, miserable and humiliating death at the hands of a man who didn't even know who he was killing. The true misery of this story is the sheer futility of it all. The fact that a bad idea, a desperate plan, can lead to an end that is both tragic and, in a very grim way, a bit pathetic. You've just been a witness to a grim, ironic tale of a predator's self-destruction, a story of a wolf who, in his desperation, became his own worst enemy. The misery there was a slow, physical torment, a death by 1,000 cuts, or in this case, 1,000 snips of a shepherd's shears. But what happens when the misery isn't a physical act, but a social one? What happens when the weapon isn't a pair of shears, but a lie? Let's leave behind the physical discomfort of a bad disguise and enter a world where the most dangerous predator isn't a wolf, but a boy with a terrible sense of humour. We're talking about the boy who cried wolf. You're there, on a vast open field, the sun beating down on your head, and the only sound is the low, monotonous hum of the insects and the constant, dull bleating of the sheep. You're standing next to a boy, a young shepherd, who is tasked with the monumental task of watching a flock of sheep. He's bored, and it shows. His eyes are glazed over. His posture is a slump of profound apathy, and he's been kicking a small rock back and forth for what feels like an eternity. He's in a world that requires him to be vigilant, to be constantly on guard. But his mind is 1,000,000 miles away. This is not a malicious boy. This is a bored boy. A boy who is just trying to find a way to make his day a little less dull. His first cry of wolf isn't a lie in the malicious sense. It's a social experiment. It's a way of testing the boundaries, of seeing what happens when you press the big red button. He's not thinking about the consequences. He's not thinking about the villagers who are toiling in the fields, the women who are baking bread, the men who are mending fences. He's just thinking about the sheer, unadulterated thrill of seeing them all drop what they're doing and come running. He's thinking about the attention, the brief, glorious moment when he's not just the bored boy on the hill, but a hero, a saviour. And so he cries out, a loud, clear sound that is a violation of a community's most sacred rule, the social contract. This is a common historical fact in a world without modern law enforcement or communication. A community's survival was entirely dependent on a shared social contract. This was an unwritten set of rules and agreements that governed everything from trading goods to defending against a common threat. The cry of wolf was a call to arms, a signal that required immediate and collective action. By lying, the boy is not just playing a prank, he's violating that contract. He's damaging the very fabric of his community, and he's making it harder for everyone to trust one another. He's a social saboteur, a tiny, unassuming wrench in the gears of a machine that is designed to keep everyone safe. The villagers, of course, come running. They drop their tools. Their face is a mixture of fear and determination. They are not just coming to save the sheep. They are coming to uphold the social contract. They are coming to do their duty. And when they get there, they see the boy laughing. He's not a hero, he's a liar. The villagers, in their exhaustion and their frustration, don't just get angry, they get disillusioned. The boy has shown them that their trust, their most valuable asset, is not to be taken for granted. He has shown them that the social contract is a fragile thing, a thing that can be broken by a single, careless act. The boy, in his boredom, has just done an immense amount of damage. He has made his community a little bit colder, a little bit less trusting, and a little bit more vulnerable to the next disaster. His second cry of wolf isn't a surprise. The villagers, now jaded and weary, respond with a collective sigh of resignation. They don't run as fast. They don't have the same sense of urgency. They've been here before. They've seen this movie, and they know how it ends. The boy, in his desperation for attention, has created a situation where the truth is no longer believable. He has made himself a liar, a boy who can no longer be trusted. He has, in a way, isolated himself from his community. He is no longer just a boy, he is a pariah, a figure of ridicule and contempt. This is a slightly obscure historical detail. In some medieval communities, a social transgressor like the boy would not be punished with a physical beating, but with a form of public shaming, a shaming parade, where he would be forced to walk through the village with a sign that proclaimed his lie. It was a form of social correction that was designed to repair the damage to the community, not just to punish the individual. The boy's misery here is a social one, a feeling of being an outsider in his own community. And so, the day the real wolf comes, it's a day much like any other. The sun is shining, the sheep are bleating, and the boy is bored. He looks up and he sees a shadow, a dark, menacing shape that is a world away from his earlier. False alarms. It's not one wolf, it's a pack, and they're not just looking at the sheep, they're looking at him. His heart, which had been so full of childish mischief, is now a cold, hard lump of dread. He opens his mouth and he screams, a real, terrified sound that is a world away from his earlier. False cries. Wolf, wolf. The wolf is here. And down in the village, the people hear him. They hear the scream, a sound that is both familiar and, for some reason, different. It's the sound of genuine terror, not of childish amusement. But they hesitate. They look at one another, a silent, weary conversation passing between them. They've been fooled before. They've dropped their tools and run up that hill for nothing. They have more important things to do. The crops need to be harvested. The children need to be fed. They cannot afford to waste their time on another prank. And so, they stay put. The misery of this story isn't the wolf's teeth or claws. It's the silence of a community that has lost its ability to trust. It's the silence of a people who have been so disillusioned that they can no longer hear the truth. Historians still debate whether the moral of the story was purely about a child's moral failing, or if it was also a political allegory about the dangers of a society that can no longer distinguish between real threats and false ones. Was it a story for children about the importance of telling the truth, or was it a story for adults about the cost of social decay, the danger of a community that can no longer rely on itself? It was likely both. The misery of this story isn't the boy's fate, it's the fact that it was a product of his own making, a tragic end born not of bad luck, but of a bad choice. The true misery of this story is the fact that a single, careless lie can do more damage than 1,000 wolves. You've witnessed the social misery of a community that can no longer trust itself, a misery that comes not from a wolf's teeth, but from a boy's careless lies. In all the stories we've told, there has been a moral, a lesson, a reason for the wolf's appearance and the victim's demise. The 3 pigs learned a lesson in architecture. Little Red Riding Hood a lesson in stranger danger, and the boy who cried wolf a lesson in honesty. But what about the countless others? What about the tragedies that never became a fable, the victims whose stories were never told, whose names were never recorded? Let's leave behind the neat, tidy narratives of our bedtime stories and delve into the vast, silent sea of unwritten legends, the miserable fates of those who simply disappeared. You're there, in the deep, dark woods, and the air is thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. There's no red cloak to be seen, no flimsy straw house, no bored boy on a hill. There's just you, and the vast, unfeeling wilderness. Your name isn't important, your story isn't important, you're just a person, a nameless, faceless traveller who's trying to get from one place to another. You took a wrong turn, a small, insignificant mistake that, in a world without GPS or street signs, has now become a life-threatening error. You've been walking for hours, your legs are starting to ache, and the sun is beginning to set, painting the sky in a grim, foreboding hue. The cold, creeping dread that you felt in our earlier stories is now a physical thing, a knot in your stomach that is getting tighter with every passing minute. The wolf, in these stories, is not a character. He's not a villain with a personality or a motive. He is a part of the landscape, a silent, ever-present force of nature that is both predictable and terrifying. He's the reason why no one in their right mind would travel alone at night. He's the reason why people would stick to the main roads, no matter how long the journey. He is the ultimate, final arbiter of a wrong turn, a missed signal, a careless mistake. The misery here isn't a grand, heroic struggle against a cunning foe. It's a slow, grinding realization that you are completely, utterly, and hopelessly alone. Let's talk about a specific, unwritten legend. You are a woodcutter. You've been working all day. Your axe a heavy, rhythmic beat against the quiet of the forest. The sun is starting to set, and you realize you've strayed too far from the path. You're lost. You try to retrace your steps, but every tree looks the same. Every path seems to lead to a dead end. Your heart is pounding in your chest, a frantic, desperate rhythm that is a stark contrast to the quiet of the woods. You are a strong man, a man who is used to fending for himself, but you are not a man who is used to being lost. The fear that you feel isn't the fear of a wolf, it's the fear of the unknown, the fear of a world that is bigger and more dangerous than you ever thought possible. And then you hear it, a low, mournful howl that sends a chill down your spine. It's not a cartoonish sound, it's a real sound. A sound of a predator who is signalling to his pack. A sound that says, I am here, and you are alone. You grab your axe, a heavy, familiar tool that now feels as flimsy as a stick. You are a man with an axe, but you are also a man who is lost, a man who is a long way from home. The end for you is not a heroic battle, it is a slow, methodical process of a predator tracking its prey. It is a quiet, unrecorded tragedy that no one will ever write a story about. This is a common historical fact in medieval Europe. The mortality rates were incredibly high, and a significant percentage of those deaths were unrecorded. People, especially those who lived in rural areas, would simply disappear without a trace. They would wander off, get lost, or fall victim to a natural disaster or an animal attack, and their families would have no way of knowing what had happened. Their grief would be a quiet, unrecorded thing, a terrible lingering ache that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The unwritten legends, the stories of these unrecorded deaths, are a grim reminder of a time when life was cheap, and a person could simply vanish without a trace. Let's talk about another unwritten legend. You are a child. You've been sent on an errand, a simple trip to a neighbour's house. You're walking on a path, a familiar path, but you get distracted. You see a beautiful flower, a small, vibrant splash of colour in the sea of green and brown. You step off the path to get it. A small, innocent mistake that has now put you in a world of profound and terrible danger. The forest, which had been a place of wonder, is now a place of terror. Every shadow seems to be a monster. Every sound seems to be a threat. You are a child who has been warned about the dangers of the woods, but you are also a child who is lost. And the wolf, in these stories, is not a character. He's just a fact of life, a grim, undeniable truth that you are now face to face with. Historians still debate whether the lack of records for these ordinary deaths was a deliberate act of omission, or simply a function of a society that didn't have the means to record every tragedy. Was it a way of protecting the living from the grim reality of the past? Or was it just a simple matter of logistics? It was likely both. The misery of this story isn't the wolf's hunger or the child's naivety. It's the sheer randomness of it all. The fact that a single innocent mistake can lead to a tragic, unrecorded end. The unwritten legends, the stories of the nameless, faceless victims, are a grim reminder that for every hero, there is a victim, and for every happy ending, there is a tragedy that no one will ever know about. This is a slightly obscure historical detail. While we often think of the woods as a place of wonder and magic, in medieval times, they were also a place of grim reality. People would use the woods to find medicinal herbs, but a great many of these plants were also poisonous. A person who was lost and starving could easily mistake a poisonous plant for an edible one, a mistake that would lead to a slow, agonizing, and completely unrecorded death. The misery here isn't the wolf's teeth, it's the quiet, terrible irony of a person who is trying to survive, only to poison themselves with their own desperation. The unwritten legends are a grim, humbling reminder that for every story of triumph, there are 1,000 stories of defeat. For every happy ending, there is a tragedy that no one will ever know about. And the wolf, in these stories, is not a villain. He is a part of the world, a force of nature that is both predictable and terrifying. His victims are not heroes. They are just people, a nameless, faceless mass of individuals who in their own quiet way had a miserable end. The true misery of this story is the silence, the lack of a record, the horror of a death that is not even a footnote in history. It's the quiet, unrecorded tragedy that is the ultimate, final, and most miserable fate of all. You've wandered through the quiet tragedies of unwritten legends, the stories of people who simply disappeared without a trace. Their fates are grim, unrecorded footnote in the brutal history of the past. In these stories, the wolf was not a character, but a force of nature, a silent, terrible part of the landscape. But every story, even the unwritten ones, must come to an end, and the end, for the wolf, is not a grand, heroic climax. It is a sad, brutal, and ultimately inevitable conclusion, a final meal that is both a beginning and an end. Let's talk about the wolf's final feast, the inevitable end, and the lingering questions that a bedtime story, no matter how grim, always leaves behind. You're there, in the cold, dark woods, and you're looking at a wolf, not a metaphorical wolf, not a symbol of hunger and fear, but a real, living, breathing animal. He's old, his fur is matted, and his eyes are clouded with a deep, weary hunger. His teeth are chipped, his claws are dull, and he is no longer the fearsome predator of our earlier stories. He is a creature who has lived a long, hard life, a life of constant hunger and constant danger. He is a creature who is now, in a very real way, at the end of his rope. His final feast is not a moment of triumph, it is a last, desperate act of a creature that is starving and cornered. He finds his prey, a small, weak animal that has also strayed too far from the path. It's not a pig, or a goat, or a little girl. It's just a small, insignificant creature, a final meal for a predator who has nothing left to lose. The end for this creature is quick and merciful. The wolf, in his final moments, is a creature of pure, unadulterated instinct, a creature who has been reduced to a single, terrible need. His meal is not a moment of joy, it's a moment of grim, silent necessity, and in that moment, he is just a wolf, a creature who is trying to survive in a world that is designed to kill him. But his victory is a short-lived one. He's too old, too weak, and too tired. He has been hunted and he has been shot, and he has been hurt. He has been a victim of his own hunger, his own stupidity, and his own nature. His body, which has served him so well for so long, is now failing him. The meal, which was meant to give him life, is now a heavy, painful weight in his stomach. He lies down under a tree, a tired, weary creature who has finally reached the end of his journey. The sun, which had been a symbol of hope and life, is now a cold, indifferent orb in the sky. The forest, which had been his kingdom, is now just a place where he will die. His death is not a neat, tidy thing. It is a slow, agonizing process of a body that is giving up. He is not a villain, and he is not a hero, he is just an animal, and he dies an animal's death. His story ends here, not with a roar or a final triumphant howl, but with a quiet, final exhalation, a last, desperate breath that is swallowed by the silent, indifferent forest, the wolf, the fearsome, cunning predator of our stories, is just a tired, hungry creature who has finally reached the end of his miserable journey, and his end is a grim, humbling reminder that for every predator there is a prey, and for every victory there is an inevitable, final defeat. This is a common historical fact in many parts of Europe. The wolf was hunted to near extinction by the 19th century, a direct result of the fear and the folklore that we have been exploring. The wolf's end in these stories is not just a fairy tale ending, it's a reflection of a historical reality, a brutal chapter in the long, complicated history of human-animal relations. The wolf's death in these stories is a grim, humbling reminder that the real world is a lot more complicated, a lot more brutal, and a lot less concerned with a happy ending than our stories would have us believe. The wolf's inevitable end in our stories is a reflection of his inevitable end in our history. His death leaves a silence, a vacuum in the forest that is both a relief and a terrible, lingering question. Why do we tell these stories? Why do we, as a species, spend so much time and energy creating these grim, miserable tales of predators and prey? What do they say about us? What do they say about the way we see the world, the way we see ourselves? Are we the helpless, innocent victims of our stories, or are we the cunning, calculating predators who, in our own way, have driven the wolf to extinction? This is a slightly obscure historical detail in some traditions. The wolf's spirit was thought to linger after its death, a ghostly presence that would haunt the woods and the people who killed it. This was a way of dealing with the guilt and the fear that comes from a successful hunt, a way of acknowledging that the death of a predator is not just a victory, but a grim, terrible loss. Historians still debate whether the wolf in these stories was a metaphor for a specific historical event or a more primal, universal fear of the unknown and the wild. Was the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood a metaphor for a bandit, a vagabond, or a stranger? Was the wolf in the Three Little Pigs a metaphor for a rival clan, a disease, or a famine? It was likely both. These stories, in their grim, miserable reality, were a way of making sense of a world that was both beautiful and terrifying. They were a way of giving a face to the forces of chaos and destruction, a way of giving a name to the nameless, faceless monsters that we all fear. The misery of these stories isn't the wolf's hunger or the victim's naivety. It's the simple, undeniable fact that they were a reflection of a world that was, in its own way, just as miserable, just as brutal, and just as full of predators and victims as our stories would have us believe. The wolf's final feast, the inevitable end, and the lingering questions that a bedtime story always leaves behind are a grim, humbling reminder that the stories we tell ourselves are a reflection of the world we live in. They are a way of making sense of the chaos, a way of giving a name to the monsters that we all fear, and in their own way, they are a way of making peace with the fact that in a world that is so full of danger, a happy ending is never a given. The hum of the fan is a softer, comforting sound in the dark. The last images of the woods, of the tired old wolf, and the quiet, indifferent forest are starting to fade, replaced by the soft glow of a nightlight, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. The stories, with all their misery and their grim reality, are just that, stories. They're whispers from a time long past, a time when the world was a little wilder, a little less safe, and a little more full of predators and victims. But you're here now, in your bed, safe and sound. The wolves are far away, and the dangers of the woods are just a memory, a story that we tell ourselves to make sense of a world that, in its own way, is still a little bit scary. So, as the last images of our journey fade, and the quiet of the night settles in, take a deep breath. Let the stories go. The wolves have all gone home.